The woman who raised me never believed I'd amount to anything, until one single envelope rewrote everything she thought she knew about her own daughter. Hi, I'm Melissa, and I grew up believing that a mother's love was supposed to feel like sunshine, but in my house, that warmth only reached certain corners, and I was never standing in the right spot. I was the middle child in a small Ohio town, sandwiched between a perfect older sister and a baby brother who could charm his way out of anything. I learned early that invisibility was my inheritance. My mother had a specific way of looking at me that I still can't quite describe. It wasn't hatred or anger. It was something emptier, like she was already calculating my limitations before I'd opened my mouth. She'd glance at my report cards with a small sigh, then place them in a drawer without comment. Meanwhile, my sister Danielle's achievements were framed and displayed in the hallway like museum pieces for everyone to admire endlessly. Danielle was everything I wasn't: tall, confident, effortlessly brilliant. She floated through high school like it was designed specifically for her success. Varsity volleyball captain, homecoming court, a perfect SAT score that my mother mentioned to every neighbor within a 10-mile radius. I used to watch Danielle get ready for school, wondering if we were even made from the same materials. She seemed crafted from gold while I felt made from something forgettable. My younger brother Kevin had his own magic, a goofy smile and quick wit that made everyone forgive his mediocre grades. Mom would ruffle his hair and call him her little comedian, excusing every missed homework assignment as a sign of his creative spirit. But my average grades were treated as evidence of laziness, proof that I wasn't trying hard enough. The same behaviors earned Kevin affection and earned me disappointment. I never understood that math. When I was 16, I told my mother I wanted to be a writer someday. She was chopping onions at the kitchen counter and didn't even look up. She said writers starved unless they were geniuses, and that I should focus on something practical. I stood there waiting for her to say something encouraging, maybe acknowledge the journal I filled every night. She just kept chopping, and I walked back to my room carrying a new weight. I applied to 4 colleges during senior year, filling out applications in secret at the public library. I didn't tell my mom because I already knew what she'd say. When acceptance letters started arriving, I hid them in my closet like contraband. One school offered me partial financial aid, but I'd need loans and a job to cover the rest. I was doing the math alone, trying to build a future nobody believed I deserved. The night I finally told her, we were cleaning up after dinner. I said I'd been accepted to state and wanted to study communications. She dried her hands slowly on a dish towel and looked at me with something between pity and amusement. She asked who was going to pay for that dream. When I explained about loans and working, she laughed, not meanly but dismissively. She said I'd never finish, that I wasn't built for that kind of commitment. Those words settled into my bones like a cold I couldn't shake. I lay awake that night replaying her laugh, her certainty that I would fail. Part of me wanted to prove her wrong, but another part wondered if she was right. Maybe I was fooling myself. Maybe I'd drop out after one semester and return home with my tail between my legs, confirming every low expectation she'd ever held. I enrolled anyway, choosing a community college closer to home where tuition was cheaper. I got a job at a grocery store, stocking shelves and running registers for minimum wage. My shifts ended at 11 most nights, and I'd drive home exhausted, then wake up for 8 o'clock classes. It was brutal, but every time I wanted to quit, I heard my mother's laugh echoing in my memory, pushing me forward. Mom never asked about my classes. Thanksgiving came, and she spent the whole dinner talking about Danielle's sorority and Kevin's new girlfriend. I mentioned I'd made the dean's list, and she nodded without looking up from her plate. Danielle gave me a small smile across the table. She wasn't cruel, just oblivious to her own privilege. I smiled back and swallowed the familiar ache of being unseen in my own family. My first year was a series of small victories nobody celebrated. I passed classes I thought would break me. I learned to write essays that earned praise from professors who didn't know my history. One teacher, Dr. Henson, pulled me aside after class and told me I had a genuine voice. She said she'd love to see me pursue writing seriously. I almost cried right there in the fluorescent-lit hallway, hungry for exactly that kind of recognition. Dr. Henson became my quiet champion. She encouraged me to apply for a scholarship for returning adult students, even though I was only 20. She wrote a recommendation letter that I never read, but imagined was full of words my mother would never use to describe me. When I won the scholarship, I deposited the check and told no one at home. It was mine, a secret proof that someone believed in me. I transferred to a 4-year university the following fall. The commute was 45 minutes each way, and I kept working at the grocery store because loans only stretched so far. My days became a blur of highways and textbooks and register beeps. I was tired in a way that lived in my marrow, but I kept going because stopping meant proving my mother right. That wasn't an option I could afford. Danielle got engaged that spring, and suddenly my mother transformed into a wedding coordinator. Every phone call became about venues and color schemes, and whether the invitations should be ivory or cream. Mom drove 2 hours to help Danielle pick her dress, but couldn't remember what I was majoring in. I watched from the sidelines, still invisible, still waiting for a spotlight that was never going to swing my direction. I threw myself into schoolwork instead of dwelling on the wedding. I wrote articles for the campus newspaper, seeing my name in print for the first time. Each byline felt like a small flag planted in territory I was claiming for myself. I kept those clippings in a folder, physical evidence that I existed and produced things worth reading. My mother never saw that folder, but I didn't need her to witness it. Junior year brought new exhaustion and new determination. I took 18 credits while working 25 hours a week, running on coffee and stubbornness. My grades stayed high because failure wasn't something I could afford emotionally or financially. Every A felt like a rebuttal to that kitchen conversation years ago, a quiet argument I was winning one assignment at a time without anyone keeping score. Danielle had her baby that December. My mother moved into her house for 3 weeks, cooking and cleaning and cooing over tiny Sophie like she was made of miracles. I visited once, held my niece briefly, and watched my mom fuss over Danielle with a tenderness I'd never received. On the drive home, I let myself feel the grief of it, not jealousy exactly, but a profound sadness for the girl who'd always wanted that warmth. Senior year arrived with terrifying speed. I had a 3.7 GPA and a portfolio of published articles, and a weariness that went bone deep. I applied for graduation with shaking hands, almost afraid to jinx it by believing too strongly. The girl who'd been told she'd never finish was about to finish. I wanted trumpets and confetti, but instead I felt quiet and determined, just trying to cross the final line. My advisor emailed me about a departmental award for outstanding seniors. She said I'd been nominated based on my academic record and perseverance. I read the email in my car outside the grocery store, still wearing my work apron. Someone had seen my struggle and called it something worth honoring. I sat there for 10 minutes, letting that realization sink into all the places that had felt empty for so long. The award ceremony was small and simple. I went alone, wearing a thrift store dress and uncomfortable heels. When they called my name, I walked to the front and accepted a plaque that felt heavier than its actual weight. The applause was polite and brief, but I heard something else beneath it. Validation, recognition, proof that I had built something real from nothing but refusal to quit. The days after the ceremony felt strangely anticlimactic. I returned to my routines, classes, work, studying. But something had shifted inside me. That plaque sat on my kitchen counter, and every morning I looked at it while drinking coffee, reminding myself it was real. I had won something. Someone with authority had deemed me exceptional. It was a small thing in the grand scheme, but for me, it rewrote years of feeling like I wasn't enough. I didn't tell my mother about the award. I'd stopped sharing achievements with her years ago, tired of watching her eyes glaze over or hearing her pivot to Danielle's latest accomplishment. Some victories taste better when you keep them close, protected from people who might diminish them without even trying. That plaque was mine, earned in silence, celebrated in solitude. I was learning that self-validation could be just as powerful as the approval I'd once craved desperately. 2 weeks before graduation, I was sorting mail when I noticed an envelope from the university president's office. My first thought was administrative. Maybe a parking fine or a form I'd forgotten to sign. I opened it standing in my tiny kitchen, scanning the formal letterhead with tired eyes. Then the words registered, and I had to sit down because my legs suddenly couldn't support the weight of what I was reading. They wanted me to speak at commencement. Me, the girl who'd hidden college applications in her closet, who'd been told she wasn't built for higher education. The letter explained that my academic record, my perseverance as a working student, and my departmental recognition made me an ideal candidate to address fellow graduates. They wanted my story, my voice, my journey. I read it 4 times before I trusted my own comprehension of what it said. I called Dr. Henson immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone. She answered on the second ring and laughed with pure joy when I told her the news. She said she'd nominated me months ago, hoping the committee would see what she'd always seen. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I was too full of gratitude for this woman who'd believed in me when belief felt like a foreign currency I couldn't afford to spend. That night, I sat down to write my speech. The blank document glowed on my laptop screen, cursor blinking with patient expectation. What could I possibly say to hundreds of strangers about a journey that felt so painfully personal? I started typing fragments about doubt, about working late shifts, about proving people wrong. The words came slowly at first, then faster, pouring out like water finally released from behind a dam I'd built myself. I wrote about my mother without naming her. I wrote about the kitchen conversation, the dismissive laugh, the years of feeling invisible in my own home. I wrote about stubbornness and spite transforming into something purer, genuine self-belief that didn't require external permission. By midnight, I had a draft that made me cry when I read it aloud. It was raw and honest and terrifying to imagine speaking those words to a crowd. The week before graduation, I revised obsessively. I practiced in my bathroom mirror, in my car, during slow moments at the grocery store when no customers were around. My manager caught me mumbling to myself near the dairy section and asked if I was okay. I told him I was giving a speech at graduation, and his face lit up with surprise and congratulations. Even that small recognition felt like nourishment for a hunger I was only beginning to understand. I debated whether to tell my mother. Part of me wanted to keep this private too, protected from her indifference. But another part, the little girl who still lived somewhere inside me, wanted her to know, wanted her to see the letter, to understand that her prediction had been wrong. I picked up the phone 3 times before finally letting the call connect, my heart pounding with familiar anxiety. She answered while cooking dinner. I could hear pots clanging in the background, the sizzle of something frying. I told her I'd won an award and been selected to give the commencement speech for my college. There was a long pause. So long I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she said congratulations in a voice I couldn't read. She asked if Danielle had mentioned Sophie's ear infection. The conversation ended, and I felt hollow. But this time, the hollowness didn't crush me. I recognized it as the final release of an expectation I'd been carrying for decades. My mother wasn't going to transform into someone who celebrated me. That wasn't the story I was living. My story was about building something beautiful without her approval, about becoming whole through my own determination. That realization settled over me like a blanket, heavy but warm, protective in its honesty. Graduation morning arrived with sunshine so bright it felt symbolic. I woke early, too nervous to sleep, and spent an hour getting ready in my small bathroom. I'd bought a new dress, not expensive, but nice enough to feel special. My cap and gown hung on the door, physical proof that I'd made it to this moment despite every obstacle, every doubt, every dismissive laugh that had echoed through my years of struggle. The campus was already buzzing when I arrived. Families streamed toward the outdoor amphitheater carrying flowers and cameras. I watched parents hugging their graduates, beaming with pride, and felt a familiar ache. Then I straightened my shoulders and reminded myself why I was here. Not for anyone's approval, but for my own completion. I had earned this day through work and tears and relentless refusal to become what others expected me to be. I spotted my mother in the crowd while walking to the reserved seating for speakers. She was sitting near the back with Danielle and Sophie, looking slightly uncomfortable in the plastic folding chair. Our eyes met briefly across the sea of people. She gave a small nod, and I nodded back. It wasn't warm, but it was acknowledgement. She had come. Whatever that meant, she had shown up, and I let that be enough for now. The ceremony began with university officials giving lengthy speeches about futures and potential. I barely heard them. My folded speech sat in my pocket, and I kept touching it like a talisman. When they finally called my name to approach the podium, my legs moved automatically. The walk felt endless and instant simultaneously. Then I was standing before hundreds of faces, the microphone waiting. The moment I'd imagined finally made real and terrifying. I began speaking about persistence, about the voices that tell us we're not enough, and how those voices sometimes come from people who are supposed to love us unconditionally. I talked about working night shifts and crying in parking lots and finding teachers who offered belief like a life raft. I watched faces in the crowd nodding, some wiping tears, and realized my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who'd ever fought to become more than others expected. I didn't look at my mother while speaking. I looked at strangers who understood, at professors who'd supported me, at fellow graduates who'd fought their own battles. My voice grew stronger as the speech progressed, steadier. By the final paragraph, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was proud. Genuinely, completely proud of myself in a way I'd never allowed before. The applause that followed felt like rain after a long drought. After the ceremony, I was surrounded by people wanting to shake my hand. Professors, strangers, even the university president herself told me my speech had moved her. I accepted congratulations with a smile that felt foreign on my face. This much positive attention was overwhelming for someone who'd grown up invisible. But I stayed present, letting myself receive what I'd earned, practicing the art of accepting recognition gracefully. My mother found me near the refreshment table. She was holding the ceremony program, my name printed inside as the student speaker. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said my speech was nice, that I'd done well up there. Her voice was careful, almost tentative, like she was navigating unfamiliar territory. It wasn't an apology or a transformation, but standing there in my cap and gown, I realized I didn't need it to be anything more. Danielle hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud. Sophie gurgled happily against her shoulder, oblivious to the significance of the day. I hugged them both back, grateful for my sister's uncomplicated affection. We took photos together. 3 generations of women, complicated and connected, standing in the sunshine of a day I'd built myself. My mother smiled for the camera, and I let that be enough. I had finally become someone even I didn't know I could be. The drive home from graduation felt different than any drive before. The familiar highway stretched ahead, but I wasn't the same person who'd traveled it countless times for classes and work shifts. My diploma sat on the passenger seat, still in its leather folder, tangible proof of what I'd accomplished. I kept glancing at it like it might disappear, like someone might reach through the window and take back what had taken me years of sacrifice to earn. I stopped at a park near my old community college campus, the place where everything had started. Children played on the swings while their parents watched from benches, laughing at small tumbles and celebrating tiny victories. I sat in my car watching them, thinking about the girl who'd enrolled here 6 years ago with nothing but stubbornness and a desperate need to prove her mother wrong. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone I'd outgrown but would never forget. Walking through the park, I found an empty bench and sat down with my thoughts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and I let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. Pride, exhaustion, grief for the years spent hungry for approval that never came. Relief that the proving was finally over. Sadness that my victory felt incomplete without someone at home waiting to celebrate it with genuine joy and unconditional love. I thought about calling my mother to thank her for coming, but the impulse faded quickly. What would I even say? Thanks for showing up after years of doubting me? Thanks for the lukewarm congratulations that felt like the bare minimum of maternal obligation? I'd spent my whole life reaching toward her, And today I finally understood that some distances can't be closed, no matter how far you're willing to travel alone. When I got home, my apartment felt smaller than usual. I placed my diploma on the kitchen table next to the award plaque, two pieces of evidence that my life had meaning beyond what my mother had ever imagined. I made tea and sat in the quiet, letting the reality settle. I was a college graduate. I was a commencement speaker. I was someone who had built something from nothing, and nobody could take that away from me now. The next morning, I woke without an alarm for the first time in years. No classes to attend, no shifts scheduled until evening. The freedom felt disorienting after so long living by rigid schedules. I wandered my apartment touching objects like I was seeing them for the first time. Books I'd studied, notes I'd taken, the coffee mug that had fueled countless late nights. Each item told a piece of my story, a story I was still learning to value. I decided to frame the commencement letter. It took me an hour to find the right frame at a thrift store, something simple but elegant. Back home, I hung it on my bedroom wall where I'd see it every morning. Not as a trophy to impress visitors, but as a private reminder of what persistence could build. My mother might never hang my accomplishments on her wall, but I could create my own gallery of proof that I mattered. Dr. Henson emailed me that week, asking if I'd consider speaking to her current students about my journey. The request surprised me. I still didn't fully see myself as someone with wisdom worth sharing, but I said yes, because her belief in me had changed everything, and maybe I could offer that same gift to someone else struggling to believe in themselves. Paying forward what she'd given me felt like the right kind of gratitude. My first speaking engagement was terrifying. 20 undergraduates stared at me in a fluorescent classroom, some skeptical, some bored, some hiding the same hunger I'd once carried. I told them about failing my first psychology exam, about crying in parking lots, about a mother who laughed when I said I wanted more. Their faces changed as I spoke, recognition flickering in eyes that understood invisible struggles. One girl stayed after to thank me, tears streaming down her cheeks silently. That conversation with the crying student haunted me for days. She told me her father said college was a waste of money for someone like her. She was working 2 jobs and barely sleeping, convinced she was foolish for trying. I gave her my email and told her to reach out whenever she needed encouragement. Walking to my car afterward, I realized my story wasn't just about proving my mother wrong. It was about lighting paths for others lost in similar darkness. I started applying for jobs in communications, sending resumes to nonprofits and small companies that aligned with my values. The rejections came steadily at first, each one a small sting that reminded me success wasn't guaranteed just because I'd graduated. But I kept applying, kept refining my approach, kept believing that the right opportunity would eventually recognize what I had to offer. Patience had gotten me this far, and I trusted it to carry me further. 3 months after graduation, I got a call from a nonprofit supporting first-generation college students. They'd seen my commencement speech online. Someone had posted a video that had quietly gathered thousands of views. The director said my story embodied everything their organization believed in. She offered me a position as a content writer, creating materials to inspire students like the one I'd once been. I accepted before she finished describing the salary. My first day at the nonprofit felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. The office was small and cluttered with inspirational posters and student success stories pinned to every surface. My coworkers greeted me warmly, already knowing pieces of my journey from the speech that had brought me here. For the first time in my professional life, I didn't feel like I was pretending to belong. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I called Danielle that evening to share the news. She squealed with genuine excitement and demanded details about my new office, my coworkers, my commute. Sophie babbled in the background, and Danielle translated her nonsense sounds as congratulations from her niece. I laughed, really laughed, feeling the easy warmth of sisterly love that had never carried the complications of my relationship with our mother. Danielle had always been kind, just oblivious to her own privileges. She asked if I'd told Mom about the job. I said not yet, and Danielle went quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. that Mom had watched my commencement speech video 3 times. She'd seen it on Facebook and watched it alone in the kitchen, rewinding parts and sitting very still. Danielle didn't know what it meant, but she thought I should know. I thanked her and hung up, unsure what to feel about this unexpected information. The image of my mother watching my speech alone unsettled me for days. I'd assumed she'd dismissed the whole event as soon as it ended, filed it away as another thing Melissa did that wasn't as impressive as Danielle's achievements. But 3 times? What was she looking for in those repeated viewings? Understanding? Regret? Or just curiosity about this daughter she'd apparently never really seen until I stood before hundreds and told our story? I didn't call her to ask. Some questions are better left unasked, their answers too fragile to survive direct inquiry. Instead, I let the knowledge sit quietly inside me, a small mystery I might never solve. My mother was complicated, our history was painful, and maybe she was processing things in her own limited way. It didn't excuse the years of dismissal, but it added a dimension I hadn't expected to find. Weeks passed, and my new job consumed me in the best possible way. I wrote articles about perseverance, interviewed successful first-generation graduates, created social media content designed to make struggling students feel seen. Every piece I produced carried echoes of my own journey, transformed into resources for others fighting similar battles. The work felt meaningful in ways my grocery store shifts never had. I was finally using my voice for something that mattered. One evening, my mother called unexpectedly. She said she'd seen something about my nonprofit in a local newspaper article featuring regional organizations making a difference. Her voice sounded different, softer, almost uncertain. She said it seemed like I was doing important work. I waited for her to pivot to Danielle or minimize the compliment somehow. Instead, she just said she was glad I'd found something good. Then she said goodbye, leaving me staring at my phone in confused silence. I didn't know what to make of that call, and I decided I didn't need to. Some relationships evolve in microscopic increments, too small to measure but real nonetheless. My mother wasn't going to transform overnight into the supportive parent I'd always wanted. But maybe, slowly, she was beginning to see the daughter she'd overlooked for so long. Whether that led anywhere meaningful remained uncertain, but I'd learned to build my life without depending on her approval. Everything else was just unexpected grace. 6 months into my job at the nonprofit, I received an unexpected email. A national education magazine wanted to feature me in their annual issue highlighting changemakers under 40. They'd found my commencement speech and tracked my work through our organization's publications. The journalist asked for an interview about my journey from struggling student to advocate. I read the email 3 times, still unaccustomed to being seen as someone whose story deserved that kind of spotlight. The interview took place over video call on a Tuesday afternoon. The journalist was warm and genuinely curious, asking questions that made me dig deeper into memories I usually kept safely buried. I talked about my mother's doubt, about working night shifts, about the professors who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Speaking so openly to a stranger felt vulnerable, but also liberating, like finally exhaling a breath I'd held for decades. When the article published, my inbox exploded. Messages poured in from strangers who recognized pieces of themselves in my story. First-generation students, overlooked middle children, daughters still hungry for maternal approval they might never receive. Each email carried its own weight of pain and hope. I tried to respond to everyone, knowing how much a single acknowledgement could mean to someone who'd spent their life feeling invisible and unworthy of attention. My co-workers celebrated the article by decorating my desk with streamers and a cake that said, "Changemaker Melissa," in slightly crooked frosting letters. I laughed and took photos, genuinely touched by their enthusiasm. These people had become my chosen family over the past months, supportive, encouraging, invested in my success without the complicated history that shadowed my biological family. I was learning that family could be built, not just inherited, and that chosen bonds sometimes fit better. Danielle texted me a screenshot of the article with a row of heart emojis. She said she'd shared it on Facebook and that all her mom friends were impressed. I smiled at her uncomplicated pride, grateful for a sister who celebrated without competition. Then she added that Mom had seen it too, that she'd mentioned it at Sunday dinner. No details about what Mom said, just that she'd noticed. I tucked that information away, unsure what to do with it. The holidays approached with their familiar mixture of anticipation and dread. Thanksgiving at my mother's house had always been an exercise in emotional navigation, smiling through comparisons and swallowing hurt alongside the turkey. But this year felt different. I was arriving not as the struggling daughter seeking validation, but as someone who'd built a life worth living independently of anyone's approval. The shift was subtle but seismic inside my own understanding of myself. I drove to my mother's house on Thanksgiving morning carrying a pie I'd baked myself. The neighborhood looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Same trees, same houses, same feeling of smallness that had once defined my entire world. But I'd outgrown that smallness now. I'd traveled beyond the boundaries my mother had drawn around my potential and discovered territories she'd never imagined I could reach. I parked in the driveway and took a steadying breath before walking inside. The house smelled like roasting turkey and cinnamon candles. Danielle was already there with Sophie, who was now toddling unsteadily and grabbing everything within reach. Kevin had come too, looking older than I remembered, his girlfriend hovering shyly near the kitchen door. My mother stood at the stove stirring gravy, and when she saw me, something flickered across her face. Not quite warmth, but not the usual dismissiveness either. Something new lived in her expression. Dinner conversation flowed around safe topics: Sophie's developmental milestones, Kevin's job prospects, neighborhood gossip. I listened more than I spoke, observing my family with the detached curiosity of someone who'd spent years studying them from the outside. My mother asked about my work, and I described a recent student success story. She nodded and said it sounded rewarding. The exchange was brief but genuine, lacking the condescension that had once colored every interaction between us. After dinner, I helped clear plates while Danielle wrangled Sophie into pajamas. My mother and I worked side by side in the kitchen, scraping dishes and loading the dishwasher in companionable silence. The quiet felt different than it used to, less heavy with unspoken resentment, more peaceful in its simplicity. I wondered if she felt the shift too, or if this new ease existed only in my own perception of our complicated relationship. She broke the silence by mentioning the magazine article. Said a woman from her church had shown it to her, asking if that Melissa was her daughter. I braced myself for minimization, for comparison to something Danielle had accomplished. Instead, she said she'd told the woman yes, that was her middle child, and that she'd done well for herself. It wasn't effusive praise, but from my mother, it felt almost revolutionary. I kept loading dishes, hiding my surprise. Driving home that night, I replayed her words like a song I needed to memorize before it faded. She'd called me her daughter who had done well. Such simple words, but they carried weight I hadn't expected to feel so strongly. I was 32 years old and still moved by crumbs of maternal acknowledgement. That realization carried its own sadness, the grief of recognizing how little I'd received, how hungrily I still absorbed even small morsels of her approval. But alongside the sadness lived something new: acceptance. My mother would never be the warm, effusive parent I'd longed for throughout my childhood. She would never frame my achievements or brag to relatives or look at me the way she looked at Danielle. That door had closed long ago, and I was finally done knocking. What remained was a quieter possibility, a relationship built on realistic expectations rather than desperate hope for transformation that would never come fully. Winter settled over Ohio with its familiar gray weight. I threw myself into work, planning our spring scholarship program and writing grant applications. The busy season left little time for brooding about family dynamics, which suited me fine. I'd spent enough years analyzing my mother's every word and glance. Now I had students to support, stories to tell, a mission that extended far beyond my own small wounds and their slow, imperfect healing. In February, Sophie had her second birthday party. Danielle hosted at her house, and I arrived with a stuffed elephant and a card I'd made myself. The living room overflowed with toddlers and exhausted parents, chaos wrapped in pink streamers. My mother sat in a corner chair, looking slightly overwhelmed by the noise, but smiling whenever Sophie wobbled past. I sat beside her, and we watched the party together without speaking, two women learning to share space peacefully. She asked about my upcoming work trip. I was presenting at an education conference in Chicago. I'd mentioned it casually at Thanksgiving, not expecting her to remember. But she had. She asked what I'd be talking about, and I explained my panel on supporting first-generation students through self-doubt. She listened with what looked like genuine attention, then said it sounded like something I'd be good at. I thanked her, surprised again by these small offerings she'd started extending. The conference was exhilarating and exhausting. I spoke to a room of 200 educators about my journey, watching recognition flash across faces as I described feeling invisible, fighting to be seen. Afterward, people lined up to shake my hand, share their own stories, ask for advice I wasn't sure I was qualified to give. But I gave it anyway, channeling Dr. Henson's belief in me, paying forward the faith that had saved me years ago from drowning in doubt. I returned home to an unexpected voicemail from my mother. Her voice sounded uncertain, almost nervous. Nothing like the confident dismissiveness I'd grown up hearing. She said she'd been thinking about things, about how hard I'd worked, about some conversations she wished had gone differently. She didn't apologize exactly, but she came closer than she ever had before. She asked if I wanted to have lunch sometime, just the two of us. I listened to that voicemail 4 times, each replay revealing new layers of emotion. My mother was reaching toward me, tentatively, imperfectly, but reaching nonetheless. I could reject the gesture, protect myself from potential disappointment, keep the walls I'd carefully built. Or I could meet her halfway, accepting that halfway might be as far as we'd ever get. Neither choice felt wrong. Both carried their own risks and their own possibilities for grace. I called her back the next evening. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. Weather, Sophie's latest words, a recipe she wanted to try. But beneath the mundane conversation flowed something quieter. 2 women testing whether a new kind of relationship could grow in soil that had always seemed too rocky. I agreed to lunch the following Saturday. Whatever happened next, I'd already proven everything I needed to prove. The rest was just discovering what might grow when I finally stopped fighting to be seen and simply let myself be. Saturday arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of bright March morning that hints at spring's approach. I changed outfits 3 times before settling on something simple. Jeans and a blue sweater my mother had once said brought out my eyes. I caught myself seeking her approval even in my clothing choices and laughed at the absurdity. Old habits lived deep in my bones, but recognizing them felt like progress. I grabbed my keys and drove toward whatever waited ahead. The restaurant she'd chosen was a small cafe near her house, somewhere we'd never been together. Neutral territory, I realized. Neither her kitchen where old patterns lived, nor anywhere connected to my independent life. Smart choice, intentional or not. I parked and sat in my car for a moment, watching through the window as she settled into a booth near the back. She looked smaller than I remembered, older somehow, her hands fidgeting with the menu nervously. I walked in, and she looked up, her face cycling through emotions too quickly for me to name. I slid into the booth across from her, and we both reached for our waters simultaneously, the awkwardness almost funny. She commented on my sweater, said it looked nice, that blue had always been my color. I thanked her and opened my menu, giving us both something to focus on while we figured out how to do this. We ordered sandwiches and soup, safe choices that required no deliberation. The waitress left, and silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, my mother cleared her throat and said she'd been thinking about what she wanted to say. Her voice wavered slightly, and I realized with surprise that she was nervous too. This meeting mattered to her, even if I couldn't fully understand why after all these years of distance. She started by talking about her own mother, someone I barely remembered, a stern woman who'd died when I was 7. My grandmother had believed women shouldn't want too much, That ambition led to disappointment. My mother had absorbed those lessons, married young, built her identity around her children's successes, because she'd never been allowed to imagine her own. She wasn't excusing herself, she said, just explaining the soil she'd grown from, the limitations she'd inherited without questioning. I listened without interrupting, watching her face as she excavated a history I'd never known. She told me Danielle had been easy to champion because Danielle's achievements felt safe, traditional. Good grades, good marriage, good motherhood. But my hunger for something different had frightened her. She saw her own buried desires reflected in my ambitions and had pushed them away by pushing me away. The recognition of what she'd done had come slowly, painfully, too late to undo the damage completely. She said watching my commencement speech had broken something open inside her. Hearing me describe our kitchen conversation from the stage, watching strangers cry at the story of her dismissiveness, she'd felt shame deeper than anything she'd experienced before. But beneath the shame lived something unexpected. Pride. Pride that I'd succeeded despite her, that her doubt had become fuel rather than defeat. She hadn't known how to hold both feelings simultaneously, so she'd stayed silent, processing alone. The food arrived, but neither of us moved to eat. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, the first voluntary physical affection I could remember receiving from her in years. Her eyes were wet, and mine were too, though I wasn't sure when that had happened. She said she couldn't change the past, but wanted to know if the future could look different. Not perfect, just different. Better. More honest about what we'd both been carrying. I told her I didn't need an apology, and I meant it. Apologies couldn't restore the childhood I'd wanted or erase the years of feeling invisible. What I needed was what she was offering now. Acknowledgement that my experience had been real, that my hurt wasn't exaggerated or imagined. She nodded slowly, understanding without me having to explain further. We sat with that truth between us, letting it breathe, giving it space to exist without demanding immediate resolution. We ate our lunch eventually, conversation drifting toward lighter subjects. She asked about my work, and I shared stories about students I'd helped, victories that felt like my own. She listened differently than she used to, leaning forward, asking follow-up questions, seeming genuinely interested rather than waiting for her turn to redirect attention elsewhere. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Something had shifted in how she saw me, or maybe in how she allowed herself to see me. Before we left, she pulled something from her purse, a folded newspaper clipping, worn at the edges from handling. It was the magazine article about me, the one highlighting changemakers. She said she'd carried it for weeks, reading it whenever she needed reminding of the daughter she'd almost lost to her own limitations. The gesture undid me completely. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried for 5 minutes, releasing grief and hope in equal measure. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was fixed. Our relationship would always carry scar tissue from wounds that had cut too deep, but the wound was finally acknowledged, finally tended to with something resembling care. My mother and I were building something new on the ruins of what we'd never had. It was fragile and uncertain and might not survive. But it existed, and that felt like a miracle I hadn't known to hope for. Spring arrived fully, bringing warmth and renewal in ways that felt appropriately symbolic. My mother and I continued meeting for lunch monthly, each conversation peeling back another layer of the complicated history between us. She told me about her abandoned dreams of nursing school, her father's insistence that she marry instead of pursuing education. I told her about the journal I'd kept as a teenager, pages filled with longing for her attention. We were archaeologists excavating a shared past we'd experienced so differently. Danielle noticed the change between us and expressed cautious happiness. She admitted she'd always felt caught in the middle, loving us both, but unable to bridge the distance that separated us. Now that bridge was slowly being built by hands other than hers, and she could finally stop carrying the weight of our family's unspoken tensions. I hugged her hard and thanked her for loving me through years when our mother couldn't manage to do so. On my 34th birthday, My mother gave me a card with a handwritten letter inside. She wrote about the daughter she wished she'd seen clearly from the beginning, determined, creative, braver than anyone she knew. She apologized not with excuses, but with simple acknowledgement of failure. She said she was proud of the woman I'd become, not despite her doubts, but through my own extraordinary resilience. I keep that letter in my nightstand drawer, reading it whenever old wounds start aching. My work continues to fulfill me in ways I never imagined possible. Last month, I was promoted to program director, overseeing initiatives that reach thousands of first-generation students across 3 states. Every success story that crosses my desk reminds me why my own struggle mattered. Not just for my healing, but for everyone who needs proof that invisible daughters can build visible, meaningful lives. My pain found purpose, and purpose transformed pain into something almost beautiful. The relationship with my mother will never match what Danielle has always enjoyed. We don't talk daily or share easy intimacy or laugh at inside jokes accumulated over years of closeness. But we've built something that fits who we actually are. 2 guarded women learning to lower their defenses incrementally, finding connection in the spaces between old hurts. It's enough. More than enough, actually, considering where we started and how far we've traveled toward each other. I still have the letter from the university president hanging in my apartment, though I've moved twice since graduation. It's joined now by my magazine feature, photos from speaking engagements, notes from students who say I changed their lives. My walls tell the story of someone who refused to accept the limitations others imposed. My mother's doubt shaped me, but it didn't define me. I defined myself, one stubborn choice at a time, until I became someone worth becoming. Sometimes I think about the girl crying in the community college parking lot, convinced she would fail. I wish I could reach back through time and hold her, whisper that the pain was building something she couldn't yet imagine. But maybe not knowing was part of the journey. Maybe faith means walking forward without guarantees, trusting that persistence eventually leads somewhere worth arriving. That girl became me, and I'm grateful for her stubbornness even when she couldn't see what it was creating. My story isn't about revenge against a mother who doubted me. It's about discovering that external validation, while nice, isn't necessary for building a meaningful life. I wanted my mother to see me, and eventually she did. But more importantly, I learned to see myself, my worth, my capabilities, my right to take up space in the world. That letter she couldn't ignore didn't change her as much as it confirmed what I'd already proven to myself. I was always enough. I just needed to believe it.